this right here. I should catch around. Okay, this is Payne Harrison. Drop handle is stick. Class of 71, Company E2, 4th Battalion, 2nd Brigade, Corps of Cadets. I was Executive Officer of Company E2 my senior year, and this is part of the E2 oral history of combat veterans of class of 70, 69, 68. So sitting here with Jim Dunham, who is participated in Operation Desert Storm in 1990 and 1991. And we'll get to that, but Jim, I'd like to start out with just kind of frame with a little bit about your personal background, where you're from, how you wound up coming to A&M, and a little bit about your Army career leading up to Desert Storm.
Okay, I went to high school in Baytown, Texas, graduated in '66. 40 of Robert E. Lee High School graduates all came to A&M. It was a poor boys school. Most of us were middle class families from a refinery town in Baytown, and we came here and joined the Corps because everybody was in the Corps at that time. In fact, our choice on our housing submittal when we got to A&M was Army or Air Force. That's what you had to check. We stood in line at Sabisa and they said Army or Air Force. So joined the Corps, was in E2, got married my senior year after summer camp, stayed in E2 my senior year, and then went in the military and was in the Corps of Engineers for 21 years, retired. And during that time, I was a combat engineer for about half of my 21 years. And then I was a civil engineer with the civilian side of the Corps for about 5 years. And then I was an ROTC instructor at A&M for my last 5 years. And during the first 10 years of my time in the Corps, I was in the 8th Infantry Division, 1st Armored Division, 2nd Armored Division, and then ended up in the 1st Infantry Division. So 2 infantry divisions, 2 armored divisions in combat engineers, and that's what led me into service in Desert Storm.
Okay. Go ahead and take a quick technical.
Yeah,
check
make
here.
sure it's recording.
Sure it's recording. All right. And
Yeah, it's working.
okay, this is Payne Harrison, drop handle stick, class of 71, Company E2, 4th Battalion, 2nd Brigade, Corps of Cadets. I was Executive Officer of Company E2 my senior year, and this is part of the E2 oral history of combat veterans of class of 70, 69, 68. So sitting here with Jim Dunham, who is participated in Operation Desert Storm in 1990 and 1991. And we'll get to that, but Jim, I'd like to start out with just kind of frame a little bit about your personal background, where you're from, how you wound up coming to A&M, and a little bit about your Army career leading up to Desert Storm.
Okay, I went to high school in Baytown, Texas, graduated in
Okay, so you get recording.
It's pretty clear for a little, pretty good clarity for that little thing.
Yeah. Okay. Can you give us a kind of a thumbnail of, before Desert Storm, when you were a combat engineer, what sort of duties would you be involved in?
Starting out as a lieutenant, we did a lot of demolition ranges, blowing up wooden structures with C4 and dynamite, and setting a lot of minefields in place, not taking the fuses out, and then having another platoon of your company come behind and take out the minefield. A lot of training with explosives, a lot of training with armored personnel carriers, which was our vehicle that we rode in, our squad vehicle. We had 4 in our platoon, and a lot of 50 cal machine gun training, a lot of weapons training, M16, M79, those types of operations. A lot of mobile bridge building with temporary bridge pontoon structures to cross creeks and streams, such as that. Anything that combat engineers could do to support our infantry or our armored divisions in the way of mobility, clearing lanes, making bypasses around restricted areas, that sort of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, where were you stationed when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait?
I was in ROTC duty at Texas A&M, and that would have been 1970. And I...
or 1990?
Not 70, 1990,
Right.
Yeah. And I was teaching cadets at A&M, and part of my duties at A&M was to train cadets in patrolling, because I was Ranger qualified, and we would go to Fort Riley, Kansas each summer for 4 to 6 weeks and do patrolling exercises as part of summer camp. And there was the 1st Infantry Division was at Fort Riley, and we were assigned a battalion to support our patrolling operations. They would set up aggressors and they would help us with different tasks. So I became very familiar with some of the infantry battalions of the 1st Infantry, along with the 1st Infantry Division staff at Fort Riley. So when Saddam Hussein started rattling his sabers and the military figured we were going to wind up going, 1st Infantry Division called me and asked if I would come to Saudi Arabia with them as part of the buildup in Desert Shield. As part of the buildup in Desert Shield. 1st Infantry had been assigned the task to breach the Saddam line. If you remember, there was a lot of publicity where Saddam promised to have the mother of all battles, and he was going to have fire trenches and minefields and all sort of a barrier along the Iraqi Saudi border into Kuwait, that area. And so 1st Infantry had been told they could beef up with pretty much as many engineers as they wanted. And so since their division staff was familiar with me as a combat engineer, they called and asked if I would go with them and help develop, organize, implement the breaching plan to launch the division into Iraq and Kuwait. And of course I said, yes, I'd be happy to go.
Okay, well, kind of take it from your point of departure from A&M to kind of your first initial arrival, first few weeks in Saudi Arabia, or did you go to Fort Riley first?
No, I got orders to go to Fort Benning, Georgia, where we had a 1 to 2 week, might have been 10-day refresher training on NBC, gas chamber. We had to requalify with weapons. We had to draw desert camouflage. We had to draw different gear. And we had to take a buttload of more inoculations for that part of the world. And from there, we flew into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I think we flew into Dhahran on a chartered 747, and then from Dhahran, depending upon which unit you were going to, they put us on C-130s, and we flew into King Khalid Military City. It was called KKMC. Basically, it was a Saudi Arabian division out in a Saudi Arabian training facility in the desert. So the C-130 flew us in there, and from there we took Humvees and trucks out to wherever our different divisions were. And I went to the 1st Infantry Division's assembly area, which was out in the desert near the border with Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Kuwait.
Okay. About how far from the Iraqi border were you when you got settled in and you're...
Oh, a couple of miles.
Oh, so pretty close.
Yeah, it was 2 to 5, not much more. Because I know while we were there, they were firing Scud missiles over us. And we had Scud alerts, and, you know, we were in tents, but we had big sand berms built around our tents, around the division area, and that we went in and out of with guards just to keep locals from coming in. Because there were still locals, there was Bedouins there with trucks with their camels and their goats, and they were carrying hay in the back of their trucks. But we would have Scud missile alerts, and we didn't see the Scuds, but we were told they were firing over us into the desert. But we never saw one hit. But we were probably within 2 to 5 miles, I guess.
Okay. And can you kind of frame or amplify a little bit about, first of all, Saddam Hussein invaded in August of '90. What time did you get there?
It was after Christmas when I actually got there.
Oh, okay, so it was...
Yeah, it was, I think originally I was told to arrive at Fort Benning before Thanksgiving. And then things started settling down politically, and the military was told back off on the buildup a little bit to tone it down. So then we were told spend Thanksgiving with our families, and then we were told spend Christmas with your families and get here after Christmas. Now the division actually went over, I'm going to say January, but I don't know, I don't remember exactly what date. But it was after Christmas, because I spent Christmas here in College Station, and then went to Fort Benning, Georgia after that.
Now, when you arrived there, was most of the men and equipment, had they already arrived?
Yes.
Okay.
All of the equipment was there. What they were doing at that time, January time frame, was replacement battalions were set up to fill slots, and critical needs like combat engineers were being assigned. And it was more of a U5 guys are going to the 1st Cav Division, U7 are going to the 1st Infantry Division. They were plugging gaps, plugging vacancies. Because the Army was still sending, this was, I thought odd, the Army was still sending officers to different schooling that they had been scheduled for. I mean, if you were scheduled to go to a career course and you were sitting in Saudi Arabia, you got picked up and got on a plane and went back to Fort Belvoir or Fort Benning and went to the career course. So you had a vacancy in that particular unit. And then they were filling those vacancies with replacements from the replacement battalions. So the Army wasn't sure, are we going to go to war?
Right.
We were posturing, we were rattling sabers. I think everybody fully expected Saddam to back off. and only a madman would not have backed off. I mean, it was very obvious to the world that there was a coalition of 17 different nations plus the United States that had all this might built up against one little pissant country, Iraq. And I think we really thought he was going to back off. And even at the last minute, the Russians announced that they were going to have a deal and that he was going to back out. So they were still trying to decide how many more people should we send to Saudi. That was kind of the climate. Are we going to go or are we going to stay? Well, stay home for Thanksgiving. Are we going to go or are we going to stay? Well, stay home for Christmas. Finally, we arrived and we were like, thank God we're finally here.
Okay, were you in place when the Battle of Kafshi kicked off?
When was that? That was during SHIELD, right?
Yeah, but it was in you got there like early part of January?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I think it was the latter part of January where Saddam Hussein came down and attacked and occupied the town of Kafshi. Now that was on the coast.
Yeah, but I think I was in country at that time.
I think that was east of your position.
It was way east of us. When you got into country, you pretty much lost track with the rest of the world. Current event-wise, you didn't really know what was going on. We didn't have any radios or cell phones or any way to keep up with what was happening. I think we were in country, but I don't remember.
Okay, once you got there and got settled in, were you kind of paint the picture of exactly where you were assigned, overall what your duties were, who you reported to, that sort of thing?
We had a senior colonel, a full colonel, that was in charge of all the combat engineer operations in the 1st Infantry Division sector. And he had 3 battalions under him of engineers, 1st Infantry from the division itself, the division combat engineers, and then 2 assigned combat engineer battalions from the 2nd Armored Division in Germany, a forward deployed brigade. One of their battalions and another battalion from a corps unit, which I think was the 130th or the 317th. The numbers escape me, but he had 3 battalions, and each battalion was going to be assigned a breach sector, and each of those battalions was led by a lieutenant colonel, and I was a lieutenant colonel. So when I first got there, my assignment under that full colonel was to go out and coordinate the efforts of these 3 lieutenant colonels, not to tell them what to do, but to go out and say, okay, you've got your mission, you're going to make that breach, you're going to make 4 to 8 lanes, what problems do you have? Lieutenant colonels talking to lieutenant colonels, not bravado beating your chest, yeah, we can do this. What do you need? How many tracks do you actually have down? How comfortable are you doing that? And then I would go to the next battalion and we would talk. And I knew most of those. I knew 2 of the lieutenant colonel commanders very well. We had been in career courses together. The 3rd one, we knew each other. Anyway, it was a no bullshit. We're going to do this thing in a couple of weeks. What concerns do you have? What can the division do to help you do this better? And then I was also told by my boss, if one of those 3 lieutenant colonels goes down for whatever reason, you're going to take his place. So you need to go out there and see that battalion, figure out what it is they're doing. And I knew a lot of their men. Some of them were Aggies that I knew from A&M. So that was the fun part. I got to go out to the field every day with a different battalion, talk to their staff. I got briefings on what they were doing. We went out into the field and watched them practice how they were going to do things. And that's what I did for about 2 to 3 weeks. We're pretty caught up on that. And then we had a friendly casualty incident in the division. We had moved up onto the lines, and we had units, infantry units at the border, and we were sending patrols across into Iraq to pinpoint where the enemy divisions were and where their artillery was and where their units were and how deep the Saddam line really was. And we had attack helicopter positions in Overwatch, and one of the attack helicopter battalions fired Hellfire missiles on one of the friendly units on one of our lines and killed 5 or 6 troops.
Was that the one that was fired at an APC?
Yes.
Yeah, that was on 60 Minutes.
Yep. Well, I was there, and it killed half a dozen troops.
Oh, man.
And they were from the 2nd Armored Division, but they were assigned to our unit, and it was reported that they were 1st Infantry Division troops. Well, they were, but they really weren't from Fort Riley. They were from Germany. And I remember our division commander had a satellite phone, the only one in the division. Every division had one. And the division commander was able to use his satellite phone to call his house and tell his wife, we had casualties. They are friendly fire casualties, but none of the casualties are from Fort Riley. So she was able to spread the word within the wives' channels at Fort Riley that, yeah, it was an unfortunate incident, but it didn't involve anybody from Fort Riley.
Right. Okay.
Well, what happened was that battalion commander whose unit fired the Hellfire missile, I think they were Hellfire missiles. They were missiles off the attack helicopters or rockets off the attack helicopters. Right. At any rate, he was relieved.
Yeah, it was the unit commander who had pulled the trigger on it.
Yes, that's correct.
Right.
I didn't know him, but he was relieved. So every unit that was there had a backup person designated to take that commander's place. So the person that went down to take his place was an aviator, an attack helicopter battalion designee, commander designee. He had been on division staff as the liaison officer to 7th Corps. And he was from the 1st Infantry Division, living in 7th Corps with direct communications to 1st Infantry Division, and he was coordinating all the activities from the 1st Corps, from the 1st Infantry Division to the 7th Corps to make sure that everybody was talking to everybody, that we knew where our borders were, that we knew who our friendly troops on each side of us were, that we weren't working in a vacuum. So he left that position, and then I was given a warning order, you're probably going to go take his position. You're probably going to go take his place. And there was probably, I don't know, a day of indecision about who should we send. Is he more critical here with the combat engineers to what we're fixing to do? Or is he more critical to us at Corps to be the division liaison officer? And the division commander or the chief of staff, one or the other, made the decision. The chief of staff called me in, really good guy, good soldier, salt of the earth type guy. He called me and he said, okay, you're going to go do that job. And then he gave me some words of wisdom and guidance. And he said, you have one day to go to every one of the 1st Division staff sections from G1 through G5 and get a quick brief on what they are doing and what they need help on at Corps. Because he said, you're not only going to go up there to coordinate, you're going up there to help us. Make sure that if we need Corps assets, we're getting Corps assets. And so I went to DeVarty and got a good brief from DeVarty Commander and the DeVarty 3. And then each of the, and the big thing that I was told that we needed to make sure of, the plan that 1st Infantry Division had been told was, you're going to breach these lanes into Iraq, and then you're going to stay on that line and keep our line of communications open. And you're not going to follow into the battle. You're going to stay on the breach lines, the entire division. And the division was very much against that. The division wanted a follow-on mission. They wanted to leave a battalion to guard the lanes and take the other 9 battalions and go on into Iraq and keep on the attack. They didn't want to have a relief in place in contact with a follow-on division. They wanted to breach and keep going and keep rolling. And so part of the Corps Future Plans Office was against that. And one of the things I had been told that I needed to do when I got up there at Corps was to make them realize that we were ready to execute follow-on missions. And I did all of that. So that's what I did. I got all those briefings and I went to Corps. I had a driver for a Humvee, and then there was already a major there, and we were on, one of us, a field grade officer, was on duty at all times, 24 hours a day. And so he or I, either one, had to be there and up. And then that's what I did during the war. When I think combat started a couple of 3 days, maybe a week later, something like that. After that initial friendly fire incident.
While we can transfer there and get set up on the map so you can walk us through.
Sure.
But before we do, one last thing is that when you were coordinating with the various lieutenant colonels, what sort of methods would be used in terms of like training for the breach? What exactly would be done? Would it be clearing the minefield, or what exactly?
The line that Saddam had said was going to be a triple belt obstacle, triple belts of concertina, mines, fire, water, never got completed where we were. It was completed in Kuwait, but the 7th Corps plan was to make this end run out into the desert to bypass that obstacle belt. And it was like, I think it was called a Hail Mary, or anyway, we went way out west and came out of the desert where there really wasn't a triple belt of obstacles. There was a berm that had been constructed, and it was maybe 7 foot tall, 6 foot tall. It wasn't insurmountable. And the biggest thing we did was take bulldozers and push through the berm. So we did a lot of training. Well, they were doing training on that out in the desert, keeping the equipment up. We had some tanks and CEVs, engineer tanks with blades and plows. And really the breaching of the berm was pushing down dirt and cutting a hole through it like a dike. The dike was only, 6 or 7 foot tall, and we just cut holes through it. So that was the training that they were going through.
Okay. All right. Let me get set up over here. Okay. I think we got that. Good.
Would it help if we
Oh, that's fine. That's fine where it is.
put this like that? Would that help? No? You tell me.
Yeah, let's do it without, I think.
You're
Let me get it. I can't
Your show.
Center here. Okay, let me, Okay, we're looking at a map of the Desert Storm Theater here, and would you kind of just give us your overview about where you were located and let me get my thing. About where you were located and as the engagement or the battle unfolded there?
Yeah, we flew into King Khalid Military City, which is right here, KKMC, and then we took vehicles out into the staging area. And so 7th Corps was in this area of Saudi Arabia and the border with Iraq, to the west of the border with Kuwait. And the 7th Corps consisted of the 1st Armored Division, the 1st Cav Division, the 1st Infantry Division, the 1st British Armored Corps, and then 1st Armored and the 2nd ACR, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. And the 3rd Armored Division was the Corps Reserve, if I recall, for 7th Corps. They weren't part of our battle plan. They were completely in reserve. We also had attached elements of the Special Forces, and the Special Forces units sent teams out into the desert behind the Iraqi lines prior to us ever going into the breach to determine the disposition and the locations of the different units that were out there. So on our map in the Corps main headquarters, we knew where their hide positions were, and then we coordinated with our individual divisions. Each of these major units, like the 1st Cav, the 1st Infantry, 2nd ACR, the Brits, and the 1st Armored, all had Lieutenant Colonel liaison officers in the 7th Corps headquarters, each coordinating our lines, making sure that we were all aware of what each other was doing.
Okay.
One of the more interesting things that happened before the actual war, the 1st Cav pulled a feint up this area on the map right here. This was called the Wadi al-Batin, and it was a natural area of a drainage into Iraq and Kuwait, which on the map looked like, well, that's a good place to go, because it was a position that was defilated throughout all the way up. So the 1st Cav pulled a pretty good feint and had some of the Iraqi forces that actually moved their units from the breach area over to block the feint at the Wadi al-Batin. And then 1st Infantry actually started preparing some of the breach lanes. We either breached 8 or 16. The number escapes me now. Lanes, and we started doing some of those before the actual combat operations started on the ground, because if you recall, they had 21 days of air operations,
Right.
cross-border, that were softening targets. And before we actually did the breach, there was an Iraqi MLRS battalion that was somewhere in the middle of our breach area. And I remember the Corps commander went up to the map and hit his fist on that battalion and said, I want this battalion to disappear before we start the breach. And so 1st Infantry had it on their designated targets, but then the 7th Corps Artillery designated it. And that battalion was ineffective by the time we started our breach.
Okay. What kind of, were these artillery pieces mainly 155 self-propelled?
And our own MLRS. Yeah, 155, 8-inch, big 8-inch. And our own MLRS. We had a lot of those. There was an Aggie battalion commander, John Gingrich, that was in charge of the division, one of the division artillery units. I think it was a 155 unit. But I went up and talked to John before the war and again after the war, while he was out there getting his units ready to go.
Yeah. He and I were in Germany at the same time.
Gingrich,
I knew
John
him.
Gingrich, yeah. he was a pretty good battalion commander. He was well thought of.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what happened to him after that. I mean, I don't know.
Okay, now the air war has started.
Yep.
You're crystallizing your plans at the corps level, and I guess the communications between you and the other units become more intense, I would say. And as this went on, what was kind of your role at that? How did that evolve?
What we were doing, all of the division LNOs from the major units were in one long trailer. And we all had communications to our division, and we all had our own division overlays. And we were all following the battle on our division maps in our trailer. And then we were walking around to our neighboring units saying, my right border is here. Where is your left border? Mm-hmm. Making sure that our overlays where we were told by our people were matched up with where Corps thought we were. We didn't want any cross-border fraternization or incidents. So a lot of the coordination was done between the lieutenant colonels in that one long trailer.
It was like a semi.
It's like a semi-trailer. Yeah, well, it was a semi-trailer, and we all had our own communications and maps and overlays, and we all had our artillery overlays that we had received from our divisions. Now this was kind of like double coordination because the division artillery had already sent all of their target list to the Corps artillery. We had copies of that, and we were making sure that it got transcribed properly. It was like a fail check.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me pause.
8 or 16, I forget exactly now how many. And then we had a huge sign up on one of them that said, "Welcome to Iraq, courtesy of the Big Red One," which, the different tanks went through. We, 1st Infantry, left 1 battalion at the breach. One of the lieutenant's platoon commanders of that battalion was an Aggie, Tom Brown. One of his very first assignments in the Army. At any rate, I went out and visited Tom before the battle started. At any rate, we made the breach. 1 battalion stayed on the breach line. The other battalions of the 1st Infantry went forward with the 1st of the 1st Cavalry of the 1st Infantry leading the way. And then we never slowed down until we got to SAF 1 Air Base.
All right, the issue that had evolved was that the whole division was going to stay in place, but after you went to Corps, did that change, that the whole division went forward?
The whole division went forward, and it came about because we didn't really experience any casualties. And we had sent probes out and the Special Forces unit that were out, and they said, hey, we are so far to the west that what's keeping the Iraqi divisions on the breach line was the Republican Guard divisions behind them. They had guns to their back, keeping them on the division. They were ready to give up. They weren't ready to put up much of a fight.
Right. Now, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, as I understand, they were out ahead of the division doing the reconnaissance.
They were on the western flank.
Western flank.
Yes.
And did you get involved in the 73 Easting engagement?
No, that was all going on. We had no idea what was going on. Other than, we heard it over the radio. We heard some chatter about what was going on. No, we didn't get involved in that at all.
Okay. In terms of the 1st Infantry Division, were they in APCs in terms of moving their units?
Bradleys.
Bradleys. Okay.
Engineers were in APCs. The 1st Infantry was in Bradleys. We had armor units, M1, A1s, and we had Bradleys. And the only difference between the 1st Infantry mech, and the first armored or the second armored was one extra armored battalion as opposed to a mech division.
Mm-hmm.
It was 6 and 4, 6 mech, 4 armored if you were a mechanized division, or it was 6 armored and 4 mech if you were an armored division.
Mm-hmm.
So they're about the same mix. You know,
Right.
give one different battalion.
Okay.
So we stayed in our sector and followed our cavalry, first of the 1st Cavalry, all the way to Safwan, and we never slowed down.
Mm-hmm. What sort of engagements did y'all encounter? What kind of resistance?
Not much, to be very honest. I mean, I wasn't. I guess if you were the lead tank and you were being engaged, it was a pretty significant event. But what we came up on was just units that had been decimated and just rolled through.
Mm-hmm.
1st Infantry Division commander gave the order, which I thought was one of the smartest things I've ever heard a division officer say, a division commander. No infantry units would dismount on the breach.
Mm-hmm.
We would go through the breach with every unit mounted so that any troop that was on the ground was enemy.
Mm-hmm.
If you saw a soldier on the ground, he was enemy. No enemy troops, because it was all done at night
Mm-hmm.
with nods, night division devices. And if there was somebody that was on the ground, they were not friendly, and they died. With the machine guns that were mounted on the Bradleys and the different weapon and the breaches on the tanks that went through, they just kept rolling.
What kind of air cover did your units have as they went forward?
We had the A-10s, the tank killers that were in front of us, and I'm sure we had fast movers above those. I remember seeing the A-10. Well, I remember hearing the A-10s,
Mm-hmm.
but we didn't see anything above that.
Mm-hmm.
We had air liaison officers, but they were so far out in front of us with the heavy fast movers that we really didn't see any. Now, they were there because we saw remnants of it when the ground war was over.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and were Apaches, were they pretty much forward with
Yes.
ACR?
Yes.
And
Yes.
I believe it was the 3rd Armored that was...
Yeah, our attack helicopter company, of course, stayed. Well, we had 2 attack helicopter companies, and they stayed with our battalion.
Mm-hmm.
But then we did have one of the 2nd ACR's attack helicopter company. In that list of boxes over there, there's a gun tape, a VHS gun tape from an attack helicopter battalion that shows them out, in front.
Okay. And now I believe the 2nd ACR commander who took the brunt of that 73 Houston, I believe he was an Aggie. I believe his name was Holder. Man, does that ring a bell?
Yeah, he wasn't 2nd ACR. He was Holder or Randy House. Randy House was an Aggie that was a brigade commander in the 2nd Armored Division.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Eric Holder. Yeah, that rings a bell. Maybe was he the 2nd ACR commander?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
So, and I
And I
believe he
remember-
went on to be a 3-star.
Yeah, I remember part of
But
that.
House, yeah, I believe. I remember seeing an interview. He said we were getting kind of complacent in terms of what the M1A1s could do
Right.
to the
Right.
Iraqi tanks.
Right.
And he put the hammer down on them. So, okay, so anyway, y'all proceeded all the way to
Safwan Air Base.
South, and where's that?
Well, it's in Kuwait, up near the Highway of Death. I'm looking for Safwan. It's over in this.
Excuse me. Go ahead.
Safwan is in this area, but I don't. Oh, it's right there, right where it says Safwan. That's where the surrender happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the surrender occurred with Schwarzkopf and the Republican Guard of the Iraqi forces. But 1st Armored went all the way and wound up at Safwan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we stayed, and we bivouacked there for 8 days in place while all of these oil fields burned.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so you saw all that.
All of that. Yeah, we slept there at night, the ground would just shake. And myself and one other engineer, the 06, went out and surveyed some of the damage to the oil fields, and we went all the way to the coast to see what other damage there was or what other destruction that they had left when they pulled out. But I mean, the enemy forces were gone when we went there.
And where did you follow them in that big trailer command center?
No, that command center never moved. The division, the Corps made the decision that communications was more important than being closer following the Corps units. So each of the liaison officers for those units wound up moving with our Humvees, and I went to the division TAC and followed part of the battle there and then talked to the other units from there. We didn't have much of a job to do when the battle started, to be very honest. We just kind of tagged along and followed.
Okay, and how did you make it up to the...
in a Humvee.
In a Humvee?
Yep.
About how far is that from where, the base was to...
From here up into there, I don't know, 50 miles?
Something like that.
Something like that. From there, I took a helicopter and went back to KKMC to help us pull our units back to start washing and cleaning, and then we went to Dhahran and then I got involved with the redeployment back to the United States.
So how long were you there before you redeployed back to the States?
90 days. And then the redeployment was 30 days. So it's about 120 days total. 120, 130, something like that. About 90 days out in the desert, and then another 30 days for the division to come back into KKMC and into Dhahran to clean our vehicles, load them on rail cars or whatever, and then for us to fly back.
And what was some of the, I guess you'd say, devastation that you saw from the American bombardment?
Well, we went down that highway of death, where the Republican Guards had been leaving Kuwait City.
Right.
And that was just, looked like a graveyard of vehicles that had been caught in that bombing. And they were just completely destroyed. The entire highway was just littered. Out in the desert, I mean, we came across bunkers that had been abandoned, where the Iraqi units just left. And we went in some of those bunkers, just looked around, checked it. We went in some of the buildings in Kuwait City and saw the destruction that had been done there. It just looked like undisciplined troops had gone through and just broke everything they could break, smash and things like that. And we saw vehicles burning and gun emplacements that had just been left. One of the interesting things I was telling you about Tom Brown, a lieutenant that was an Aggie, he was out in a unit in the desert, and this was after the war, and I was going around just in a Humvee visiting different engineer battalions and seeing, what was going on. Were we ready to do this or that? And while I was visiting with this Lieutenant Brown, an Iraqi civilian, one of his platoon sergeants came up and said, there's an Iraqi civilian here, a lady, and she said her home is covered on the inside with howitzer rounds. The Iraqi army had used her home as an ammunition dump. and they had stacked up howitzer rounds in her home. And this platoon sergeant told his platoon commander that this lady would like us to move all these rounds out of her house. And we said, no, that's their problem. We ain't moving no rounds out of anybody's house. But so there she was stuck with the house full of howitzer rounds, 122 millimeter howitzer rounds, floor to ceiling, just stacked. And I guess the thought process from the enemy artillery was we wouldn't notice they were there, and they wouldn't get blown up. So they left and left all their rounds there.
What was the feeling, your feeling, the feeling of your comrades and everything, when the ground campaign came to such a quick conclusion?
We thought it was too quick. We thought that this ain't over, because we still had a lot of Republican Guard units out there with all their tanks. In fact, our first division cavalry squadron was at Safwan, was facing a Republican Guard unit, and they both had their cannons faced at each other. It was kind of a hold, a hold in place while we try and figure out, are they going to surrender? Who's going to surrender? Who's going to take the flag? And we felt like, well, they should have had to walk out. We felt like they should have stayed. I mean, they should not have been allowed to take all their vehicles, but they took all their armored vehicles and went right back down the highway to Baghdad. And we watched them go. And I think there was some engagement between maybe the 3rd ACR or one of the other units to our west, and not one of our units, but I think there was 1 or 2 engagements, and then it was stop, ceasefire. And so we felt like, well, it was over too quick.
Okay.
Can't be over, because too many enemy units still walking around out there. What are we doing? And they rode their vehicles back to Baghdad.
What was your how big was the prisoner of war issue that you're?
Oh Lord, that was a big issue. I remember being in the division main, and we had an MP that was there, and she was an Army captain, and she was the liaison from the Corps MP battalion to the Corps main, and they started getting reports in of 500 prisoners, 1,000 prisoners, 4,000 prisoners, and people go, what? Where are we going to put all those? And so they just took concertina and just unrolled rows of concertina and put them in there. And there was nothing else to do with them. We really couldn't. I felt sorry for her, because the Corps commander and the Corps chief of staff was asking, what are you doing? How are you processing these? Who's doing what? Well, hell, nobody knew. Nobody had 5, 6, 7, 8,000 prisoners to contend with. So the solution they came up with, give them to the host nation, the Saudis, and let them deal with them. I mean, we didn't have anything to feed them other than MREs. And the MREs had pork, and of course they were Muslim. So we gave them water and treated them humanely, but they were happy to be out from their foxholes. They were happy not to have the Republican Guards. Most of the prisoners were from the infantry units that were only there because the Republican Guards were keeping them there. That was our opinion. That's a generalization, of course. But we were happy to let the Saudis take over. There was just too many.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how many we wound up with, thousands. I remember driving by one of the POW camps, and I thought, oh my gosh, how would you even begin to secure those people? It was like a city, and they were just all sitting there.
Wow.
On their, on their haunches.
What was the weather like?
Oh, it was cold as hell.
Oh, it was cold.
Cold. We had parkas, and it wasn't enough to keep us. It was warm. It was cold and windy and rainy. Miserable weather. It was deer hunting weather. You know, it was just wasn't very good. In fact, it was good. It was better when we got to Kuwait because of all those oil wells burning. You know, it was warmer, but there was oil dropping out of the sky.
Oh wow!
Droplets, you know, and you were a little warmer because you'd see all these fires and the ground was just shaking. And then what's all over my poncho or my parka, you know, it's grease. Oh, it's oil. Oh, there's oil in the air.
Raining oil, black rain.
Yeah, it was really weird. It was very, very weird.
Boy.
One of the weirdest things that happened to me, this was after, you know, the ground war had stopped, and so everybody had been told stay in place. Well, we went out to make sure that our unit's borders and boundaries were tight. Okay, 1st Infantry is on this latitude, longitude, 7th Corps is over here. You know, let's don't have any cross. Let's make sure. And so it's night. It's pretty dark. And we were following tank tracks looking for some units, you know, just my driver and I. Indian kid from Oregon, Wayne Miller. And he was 18 years old. He had his 18th birthday during the war. And so I said, Wayne, I got to take a leak. Pull over here, but stay in the tank tracks, you know. There was nobody else out there, nowhere around us. So we pulled over, and I got out on my side, he got out on his side, and we're taking a leak. Heretofore, we had both taken our flak jackets off, and we were sitting on our flak jackets because there was no more threat of being shot. The threat was running over a mine and having your damage come from your bottom. So we had our flak jackets and we were sitting on our flak jackets. So we get out of our vehicles, we're both taking a leak, and I look down and there are literally hundreds of bomblets, flechette bomblets on the ground around our vehicles that the Air Force had dropped.
Right.
And I looked down and I quit peeing and I said, Wayne, don't move. I said, look down at your feet. And we could barely see each other. It was dark. And I heard oh, shit. I said, Wayne, get back in the vehicle. And we both got back in the vehicle. And I said, back out of here in the same tracks that you came in on. And we did, and that was it. You know, there was nothing else. Those same flechettes, we had some troops pick them up and put them in a backpack, and they blew up. And it maimed some medical forces that were being carried out to a hospital of some sort to do something. The little bomblets, you know, they had little fins on it.
Right.
And
they're devastating.
There was explosive ordnance everywhere on the battlefield. So you know, I told Wayne, I said, I think we've pretty much surveyed all we're going to survey. Let's get back on the main MSR. And we went back to where we went back to division.
I see. Okay. All right. Well, appreciate your time
Yep.
here today. I think you covered the waterfront fairly well. Is there any particular memory beside the flechette one that you'd like to get on the record or anything?
No, that was probably the most interesting after the war. Like I said, you know, during the war, we just followed behind. We didn't really participate other than just keeping track of what was going on. It was just over too quick. I mean, it was wham, bam, it was over. You know, now what do we do? Well, we're going to sit here and think about it for a while the politicians figure out what we're going to do. And I think that was the overall mood was, it's over? Is that all there is? I mean, we spent months coming here and doing this, and now we got all these Republican Guard troops out there that are still in their vehicles, and we're not going to do anything about it. So, anyway. Then our emphasis was on, let's get the hell out of here and get back to the States. You know, let's get out of here.
Right.
So, that was another 30 days then.
Were the, in terms of when you were in there, logistically, did y'all feel like you had all the supplies you needed? equipment, ammunition, everything.
Yeah, the only disappointing thing was when the war was over and we were in place up at Safwan, and they did the ceasefire. I don't know exactly when it was, but they told us, they said, we're going to have steak dinner and beer flown in. And everybody's going to get a steak, and you can have 2 beers or 2 Cokes. And so we stood in line, and I got 2 beers, and my driver, 18-year-old Wayne Miller, got 2 Cokes. And we each got a steak, and the steaks weren't great, but it was better than sea rations. It was cool. We were eating in our vehicle. And the 2 beer I had were Korean non-alcoholic warm beers. And his Cokes were ice cold Cokes. I said, Wayne, you want to trade a beer? He said, no, sir, you made the wrong decision. So I had 2 non-alcoholic beers. And then I had Aggie muster April the 21st in Dunham with Bob Westholm, who was also in 1st Infantry Division. Good friend of mine. We were in CGSC together. We were in 1st Armored Division together. And then we wound up 1st Infantry together. So he and I, we split a non-alcoholic Korean beer in Daran on April the 21st for Aggie muster. And it still tasted terrible.
Okay, well, Jim, I sure appreciate your time. I think it's a great addition to our oral history project, and there's nothing to preclude us if some memory comes to mind that we can amplify this.
Sure.
But appreciate it.
Yes, brings back memories. Oh, I just thought of something. This is kind of a neat thing.
Okay, let me... Okay, and one addendum to your oral history. Okay.
After the war, while we were still waiting in place, the division, 1st Infantry, was given the task to fly out to an abandoned airfield. And I'm trying to remember if it was, there was an abandoned airfield. It could have been here at Talil. I think it was the Talil airfield in the Euphrates River Valley. And so the division...
You want to point that out again?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it was the Talil airfield. It had been bypassed, and there was reports that the airfield was in good enough shape for us to land planes on. So the division air officer wanted to go out there. He was an Air Force major. He wanted to go out and look at it, and the division asked me to go as a combat engineer to see how much damage was done to the airfield. The Air Force had dropped bombs on it. So anyway, the division air officer, myself, and a couple other majors went out in a helicopter, an Apache. And we flew out there, and 2 things really happened that was funny on the way out there. One of them, we were flying over the desert, and we saw a pyramid, and it was like 50, 75 foot tall, and it was a square pyramid. And I looked on the map, and it was the city of U-R,
right,
where Abraham was from, or Abraham, I don't know my Bible that well, but Abraham did something at and we were flying around it, and the chief warrant officer flying said, sir, what is that? And I said, well, my map says it's and that's where Abraham was historically connected. And he said, Abraham Lincoln? I said, no, Chief, not Abraham Lincoln, Abraham of the Bible. So we get out to Talil Air Base, and the pilot didn't want to land. And the air officer said, well, let's get as close as we can. So we flew over and got within 10, 15, 20 foot of the runway, and we're driving along and we're flying and we're looking, and I'm looking at bomb damage, and it wasn't really that terrible. It was some. But all of a sudden the Air Force officer just gets all excited. He said, look in that hangar. There's a MiG-23 or a MiG-21. It was a MiG. And it was in this hangar, and it was undamaged. I mean, it was in this pristine condition. He said, let's fly over there. So we hovered, and we're hovering in front of the hangar. And the Air Force officer says, I have got to go look at that MiG, And the pilot said, well, we ain't landing. And we're not going to land. And they turned to me and they said, you're the senior officer of the aircraft, so you're technically the aircraft commander. I said, well, the Air Force officer says, look, I got to go look at it. It's important. He really just wanted to go take a picture. That's what he wanted to do. I said, well, hover as low as you can get to the ground without landing. And so they hovered about 5 or 10 foot. And the Air Force officer and I got on the skids, jumped out, climbed up on the MiG. The Air Force officer got down into the seat, and I took his picture. And we got back on the helicopter and left.
Okay.
Oh, that was kind of funny.
Okay. Well, thanks. And again, if anything comes to mind, just let me know and we can revisit. Okay.
That Euphrates River Valley was really a beautiful